Hi, I'm Lauren Lavoie, and this is one of several video lectures, philosophical in nature, entitled The Lincoln Diaries. And the reason for that is because I'm driving a 1998 Lincoln Continental, and I highly recommend it as a used car. It's unbelievably reliable. The title of this lecture it's entitled Understanding Is Blindness. And that may not make any sense at all. Hopefully it doesn't make a lot of sense to you. If you've never encountered, it looks like it's snowing and it's 45 degrees out. Those are chicken feathers, I think. Basically, you can follow along in one sense with the metaphor about the fact that I'm driving a vehicle. And in driving this vehicle, there are two things that basically I have to be aware of. One is the known. The known simply is all of the structures and the guide work and the speed limits and all that stuff that doesn't change. I have to engage with that. Now, as a result of the fact that I'm moving, which a lot of us don't do anymore, but that I'm moving through reality, what I will encounter, I'm not entirely certain about. And for some people, getting in their car and driving somewhere is a big deal. We all have our phobias or difficulties. So the idea is to let go of what I've just experienced, as in any literally active movement through any aspect of reality. My job in a sense is to let go of what I've just experienced so that I can be aware of what's happening in front of me. And so it's easy in a sense, with variation, it's easier in a sense to apply this principle to driving. We're held accountable, really. Reality holds us accountable to be both aware of the potential unknowns and to, as we encounter or work within the confines or limitations or structures of the known, to let go of that. So what I'm experiencing before me, you can't see that. The only thing that you can see is my past relative to, driving from point A to point B. And in this case, I'm going from Glenham, New York to Hopewell Junction. And so the basic deal is that we're all at wherever you find yourself in your life at this point, you'll notice that your knowledge base is based on the experiences that you've had and the experiences maybe that you'd like to have, that you have concept about, or that you've been shown pictures or video, or other people have told you about experiences that they've had that you'd like to have. So the one thing that really trips people up is that there's a issue between the known and the unknown. And as a recovering control freak, I can tell you that being unwilling to abandon, even for a moment in time, the known for the unknown was extremely difficult for me. Control emanates. The justification for control normally is fear. Fear, as you know, is something that you either believe in or you don't. So if you have a fear that you believe in, then the justification for protecting yourself or your loved ones, etc., becomes, quite, reasonable, because fear, which is based on the known, is threatening you. And so the idea is to, in terms of the confines of the intellect-ego world, which is a kind of illusion. It's real, but it's also an illusion. The idea is to either live in a way that you can profit from the known world, and or live in a way that you can venture out beyond the known world into the unknown. And so my point to people is, if you want to have an adventure in life, if you're tired of the repetitive nature of the ego intellect, then the work is to figure out a way. And normally, the best suggestion is to work with meditation, because in meditation it's much easier to recognize the movement of the intellect ego and all of its, ways of trying to take control of our consciousness. And so a lot of people don't understand that they are fractured on a fundamental level, because of the ego intellect. The nature of the ego intellect is a fracturing mechanism. And so what I've said before in my other work is that if you have an individual that is equal to all other individuals, and I'm speaking on a spiritual level, that I believe that we're all equal in nature, equal in value, we're equal in our preciousness to each other. What the ego intellect does, and I think I shouldn't say that it's obvious, but when you look into it, you'll see that it's obvious, is that what it does, its primary fracture of equality is, in whatever varying degree, or in whatever, painted faces or impressions or self-images that you have, the ego fractures equality into superiority and inferiority. And that is part of the known world, in the sense that you experience inferiority or superiority. You may have a conflict with it or not. Before people really wake up, the conflict normally is between their inferior self and their superior self. And the idea would be to diminish their inferior self and enhance their superior self. And so this is true with every fracture that the ego intellect is responsible for. There's a war, in a sense, a conflict between each fraction. I'm not going to get into the fractures that occur as a result of those fractures. That is something that you can look into if you like. The point that I'm trying to make is that when consciousness is relegated to perceive the real reality around us through the ego intellect, we will not have a spiritual experience. We can only, and are limited to having an egotistical experience. And that's something that a lot of people have a difficult time accepting. And, sometimes right off, from the start, they view that as absurd. And that's fine. But I always recommend to people that are interested and curious about this kind of thing that they develop a working, active relationship to meditation, so that they can actually see the process, the symptoms, the results of the ego intellect working. So, understanding is blindness simply means that if I place my knowledge base between myself and the world around me, what I'm going to do is I'm going to wind up having experiences with mirrors of myself. And if you haven't gotten into a relationship which reminds you a great deal of your mother or father, this is the point, at which, you'll want to pay attention, because we don't want to have, in other words, if you don't do the work of mastering your ego, what's going to happen is that your ego, the lessons that emanate from it, are going to manifest in your personal relationships in your life. That's the first thing people say is, I don't want to turn out like my mother or father. And it's, for some people, they like, being like their mother or father. Maybe they had a healthy relationship with them. But the basic thing is that the mirrors, when you get into karma is relegated to the illusionary realm. I don't deal with karma anymore. Not much at all, because my interactions with reality they're not egoless all the time, but my primary interaction with reality is, it's not egotistical in nature. And so what I had to do in order to get here is that I had to call into question the beliefs that I had, the conclusions that I drew, the judgments that I made, which were all based on my past experiences, and ask myself if I wanted to either carry those, or if I could or would be willing to abandon those to the unknown. And so the reason why, faith becomes critical in spiritual practice is simply because you can't experience reality without it. And the reason why that is because reality changes all the time. So in other words, if I had a great experience, the other day I had an awakening in some shaman work that I was doing, and my immediate instinct is to try to reproduce that experience the next time that I engaged in that exercise. And it's not possible because, and you'll notice too that you never have the same dream. I think very few people would have the same dream twice, but you'll notice that the living world is not a world that reproduces itself in repetitive form over and over and over again. And so this is a challenge for us, because the only way to develop and move forward on our path is to experience reality in its newest or next, change-filled form as often as possible. And so there are techniques to do that, and one of the techniques is to look at our belief system, ask ourselves, find out what our belief system's based on. So however positive or negative your beliefs are, consequently your thoughts, belief will never be able to navigate you or serve as a guide, to the unknown. It's just not possible. So we have this conflict between, and we'll always have this conflict. Something we can truly rely on is between the known and the unknown. One of the statements that I heard early on was, nothing like contempt prior to investigation will keep mankind in so much everlasting darkness. And that's true, I found. That knowing beforehand whether or not something is worth experiencing or not is one of the most arrogant things that I've ever engaged in. It's just as though I'm looking from a distant or separate observational standpoint, and the degree of arrogance that I had, at that time, and I'm still quite capable of it, in, deciding whether or not something that I've never experienced before held any value for me personally. I did that so often that I wound up in a very isolated, lonely, empty state. So it's true that, if somebody is suggesting something new to you and there's fear, there's always going to be fear, because there's always going to be the ego. Now, if you live, the reason why, living a life of service is so important and doesn't have to be associated with religion at all, neither does faith, but the reason why it can be so important and incredible of an experience is because it allows us to move beyond or be liberated for a period of time from the ego nature. Normally, people that have come to view themselves through the ego and view others in reality through the ego have a fairly bleak and or unrealistic view of themselves in reality. And so to broaden this, what you can see is, or look at, is that if you've got societies, groups, organizations, or societies and institutions that are based on the intellectual egotistical dynamic, they're capable, and they have produced a kind of second world to the initial primary originating fundamental reality world that exists here. And so the problem is that if you're raised, and the reality is that being raised in a world that's not entirely real is really difficult to get out of. Marketers spend, and research for marketing, there's an inordinate amount of money spent trying to find out what you will react to. And, as you know, that if you believe that you're inadequate, you'll be looking for, if you believe it, you'll be looking for something to make you feel adequate, equal to, or greater than others. It depends on your bent in realities, what you really, hold dear and all that. But there are groups of people, and there always will be, and there always have been, its primary sole purpose in their motivation for continuing to live life is to profit on your insecurities. And this can be a very subtle thing, You look up cradle to grave marketing, look it up. It's all there. But that second world, that egotistical base or ego-based world of selfishness is just a natural result of not having done the work of dismantling, our belief system and living in a way that we can not have to endure, and sometimes they're shields, protective shields from the ego, or not. The thing is that that kind of brings up a really good point, because the ego serves us greatly in the first, 21 years or so of our life. And especially if you were traumatized or neglected, whatever, the ego defaults into place to protect you so that you don't dissolve, But what happens, of course, is that, if the ego isn't looked at and understood in terms of how to, in terms of what it's attempting to do and how we fall prey to its, its attempt to acquire control of us, then we will, wind up in a pretty unfulfilled lifestyle. And all that's optional. There's no there's nothing stating that, you know, that you have to stay where you are. But as Einstein said, human beings suffer from a kind of optical delusion of the consciousness. I believe what he was referring to was the ego-intellect dynamic. And so, of course, I'm not going to ever say that there isn't a proper place for the ego. I'm not going to say that there isn't a proper place for the intellect. There is, and it brings us back to motivation. And so, in my view, if you can get a handle on your pure, like your real, true motivation for what you do and do not do on a daily basis, and ask yourself if you want to continue taking action, you know, on those motives, ask yourself if you appreciate the results that those motives bring. So the reality is that motive is result, and result is motive. So if your result, if you haven't looked at motive at all, and your results are really poor, and you don't appreciate them, then you know that there's an issue with the motivation. And so in anything, it's really key, it's critical, in anything involving spiritual or philosophical endeavor, anything at all really that involves the intellect and perception, it's really critical to understand what our real motive is. I've used my ego to protect myself, and I've used my ego to protect myself in ways that crippled me and my ability to move about these differing or changing aspects of reality. The reason why that I used my motive to cripple myself is because in being in a crippled state in the known, I found it very predictable. I found others that also were crippled and enjoyed being, you know, crippled in a sense. Obviously, I didn't recognize that I was crippled. I was climbing, you know, the ladder, the egotistical, illusionary ladder of prestige and power, I thought, and all the rest of it. I used my ego to prevent others from making a kind of intimate contact with me, and hid from vulnerability, because vulnerability in my past, the way my ego played on me is it would always, you know, threaten that the last time I was truly vulnerable and open, which was when I was a child, I was hurt, and the ego served me by helping me shut down or move my target in a sense. And this was really helpful. It allowed me to kind of stabilize, you know, to a certain degree or another. What happened with me is that my internal self, which needed spiritual sustenance, nurture, love, light, all the rest of it, was becoming more, you know, and more starved as a result of feeding my ego and pretending really that was my true self. And that's where I became completely inverted, is where I became convinced that my ego nature was my true nature. And so, you know, you can get into a lot of weird thinking about what your true self is and is not and all that. The suggestion that was made to me was to take action on my healing nature. And so the point was made to me that if an individual takes action on their true nature, they will experience a kind of fulfillment that will liberate themselves from the shell or the distortion of the ego mind dynamic. And, you know, I was petrified, and for many reasons, but I started to take action on my nature. And it doesn't matter what your nature is. If you're a dancer, if you're, you know, an artist of whatever sort, writer, the whole point is to take action on that nature. And it was told me that if people didn't take action on that nature, that it would poison them. And that's exactly what happened to me, is that I became a kind of, poisoned soul, as it were. But as I started to take action on my nature, I started to realize that there was this other world that opened up to me. Now, this other world isn't perceivable by the intellect, brain, visual cortex dynamic, because it rides on a different frequency. And so this is why there'll always be a conflict with people that believe in the spiritual realm and those that don't. And if you're in one or the other, the alternative one, is not real to you. And so as long as I was invested completely in the egotistical world and riding the frequencies of that illusion, I wasn't able to see the spiritual world that was all around me. And so as somebody that's been deeply, engrossed in the illusionary realm and hiding and riding my intellect for some years, I can tell you that the spiritual realm is very real. But it will not default into place as a result of any kind of intention. It requires work, It requires reaching, it requires study, it requires tenacity, it requires perseverance. And the governing law that surrounds the world of the ego is that you'll notice maybe that the ego intellect, even though it's a kind of illusion, and as purposeful as it can be, is material based. And I've mentioned this in my other work, is that gravity acts on all things material. And also as a material entity, it can cloud up, so smoking, caffeine, drinking, other things that you may or may not do can add weight to the ego. And so this is good, for the ego. It loves that. It loves that you would be burdened. And I don't mean as, it doesn't have its own will, it's just automatic. But the other, and it's not just that, say that, well, there's a spiritual world, encounter it, live in it, etc. It's not, to me, good enough to encounter the spiritual world. I believe that my purpose here, and maybe you're not here to develop, maybe you've already learned your lessons, but there's a degree of, there are varying or degrees of light in the spiritual world. And so you don't want to just necessarily stop at having experienced some of the, beautiful aspects of the spirit realm, but go farther, find out what it is in your nature to do. This will, as you practice, take action on that, will liberate you from the illusionary world. Once you manage to live in a way that you're mostly liberated from the illusionary world, continue to seek out, teachers and experiences that will help you evolve spiritually. And so you can say that, it's a prize, it's a treasure to get to a place where we're not inundated with or, blanketed by the ego intellect dynamic. But that's really just half, the picture. The idea is to, once having, learned how to live outside of the restrictions and limitations of the ego, is to then do whatever spiritual work you have to do there so that you can actually grow and evolve here. So we say that, just summing up, that understanding is blindness in the sense that all my experiences will not help me move into the new ever-changing world. And that was something that I may have left out, is that reality, living reality, the living moment, is change filled in nature. And so this is why, the Buddhist would say you can't put your hand in the same river twice. The river represents life, the living moment, as it changes constantly. And it does change constantly. And so it's really interesting, because we have this, unbelievably simple, nearly black and white, and if not, it probably is, completely black and white, blueprint of reality. And anyway, so that will wrap up this session, and I look forward to presenting more information in the future. Take care.